Welcome to Plato's Dialogues once again, and we're here with AP, the unshaven, and NP, the shaven one. And we're going to talk today about a very relevant topic that has a lot of consequences in the way we think about pretty much everything, Protestantism and the Reformation. I want to start today's talk with you, bro, with a quote from one of my favorite thinkers ever, Christopher Dawson. And this is the quote: "The process of secularization arises not with the loss of faith, but the moment men feel that religion is irrelevant to the common way of life, and that society as such has nothing to do with the truths of faith." I think that's pretty sweeping. Yeah. And I obviously today we're dealing with the secularization of pretty much all our major institutions in our social order. And the Reformation is a big part of where we got to where we got today. So I really want to focus on the historical reality of the Reformation versus what I would call the liberal myth, or even the liberal mythology. So maybe you can start by giving us a little context of the way you've taught me and the way you talk to me about the Reformation, not really as a theologian, so to speak, about like justification by faith, but more about the social order or things like that. Can you help us understand kind of the context in which you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I think I want to talk about the Reformation as an event in history, and as a central event in history, and a place of importance given to it because of its amazing consequences, right? Not necessarily amazing in a good way.
Right.
And focus on it in that way. There are theological dimensions to it that would be worthy of whole conversations. But this is a conversation I think that I would like to invite all Christians to, and non-Christians as well. So there's two particular thinkers that I'm interested in getting into that are both Protestants, and one of them his name was William Cobbett, and he was born in 1763, so that's a long time ago.
Yes.
Died in 1835. He was actually born an Anglican, lived as an Anglican, died as an Anglican, was buried in an Anglican cemetery, so he was a Protestant. Okay. Right? He never gave that up, but he was interesting because he was part of the Catholic emancipation movement in the early 19th century, trying to argue and engage in activism for the sake of the justice, right, of Catholics in his country.
Interesting. Sounds like an interesting fellow. So what you're going to talk about isn't the theological aspects,
Not directly, no.
Lutheran doctrines of free will or something.
No.
And what you want to talk instead about what the Reformation was historically,
yes,
and its relation to, I'm very interested in the liberal myth, because
right,
when I grew up and when I taught first in the schools I was teaching at, which were all Protestant, the history books were the same. In fact, I used our sister, Emily is her name, and she had a textbook. It was by a Lutheran, a very old school textbook, and literally it gave the Reformation was this wonderful moment that mankind was freed from the shackles of some
monkish superstition,
popery, popery, all that stuff. Right. Yeah, I remember a picture that had a podium. It looked like a podium to me. Yeah. It was a podium at that time. It was a lectern with a Bible chained to it.
Yes,
and it had that the church chained up the Bible and kept it from the people because it was somehow worried the people would discover the truth. And so that was
because
the whole,
Bibles, when they're freed from chains, they go around liberating people.
Right,
they just walk around and just free you from slavery.
Yes, yeah, the little
in and of
legs
themselves,
and arms and face. So that was the version I got. And even when I started teaching U.S. history and European history as a Protestant, the view was essentially very positive in the sense of the effects. The cultural effects are this innovation. Individuals are freed. This is a good thing. Henry VIII even was looked at as someone that was
strong ruler.
Yeah, strong ruler. He made the state more powerful. And of course, good Queen Bess and Bloody Mary. So, and then I became a Catholic, and I learned a little about not just as a Catholic necessarily, but getting into history of today's scholarship. Yeah. That seems to be going a different direction. And that's where maybe Cobbett comes in, because you've talked to me about Cobbett before, and I guess for the viewers, I really want to ask this really sophisticated question, okay? Why does Cobbett kick ass?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay.
I think the reason he kicks ass is because he's an honest man, right? He cares about justice. He actually studied. He was very philosophical, very historical, but he was also an activist and put his thoughts into action.
Okay.
Right, and he's trying to tell the history. Right, he says the book that I'm thinking of is called The History of the Protestant Reformation, and those quotes are his, in England and Ireland.
Okay.
And he wrote that in 1824. And he appeals, in the very beginning, he says, "I want to appeal to all sensible and just Englishmen." because he thinks that the histories that have been written about the Reformation, he even says this in the very beginning, he says every history that he's ever seen and grow up with, the kinds we give our children in England, he says they're all basically garbage, they're trash, right? They're completely written by the toadies, right? The eulogists of these rulers that were doling out power.
So I want you to let's get into the Reformation. Like what did he say?
Let me say one more thing about why he kicks ass. So he tells us about
all this is why he kicks ass,
yes,
right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So he tells us what the Reformation really is. He tells us historical truth about it.
Okay.
Right. So it's what we would now think of as revisionist history, although he wrote this in 1824.
Which is weird irony.
It was revisionist history at that time. Right? But then he tells us about the consequences, and that's what I'm interested in. To me, the consequences of the Reformation, of this event, which he describes in truth.
Okay, so I see two things.
Yes, two things there.
So what it is, historical truth, and then consequences.
Yes.
Let's use that to break down this conversation. All right, so I want to know, he has some kind of thesis, his book is making some kind of point.
Yes.
All right, can you give me what his idea of the Reformation, like in a nutshell, briefly,
So
what does he say the Reformation is?
He says that the Reformation was engendered in beastly lust, right? Brought forth in hypocrisy and perfidy, which is an old school, cool moral word for deceitfulness, dishonesty, right? And fed by rivers of English and Irish blood.
Wow.
That's what it is.
That's crazy, man.
Yes.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
And also,
it doesn't sound like a good thing.
No, it doesn't. Now, does he believe now, I as a history teacher, I teach that there wasn't, and there's not one Reformation.
No.
But I talk about, like, I divided up like continental Reformation, the Calvinist Reformation, the English Reformation, the Counter Reformation. That's how a lot of historians think of it today. Right. What would Cobbett say, or what do you say about that? Is there one Reformation? Is there multiple Reformations?
I mean, it's all these events going on at the same time, but the aim was the same, right?
Okay.
The Reformation, the Protestant Reformation was in protest to, right, the claims of the Catholic Church to have a kind of supremacy, the papal supremacy, right, was a claim to reject that. And Henry VIII, obviously, the first one to explicitly reject that for his reasons, right, which are pretty well known.
So let's talk about Henry VIII.
Yeah.
I think that would be good.
I want to read a little quote about Henry VIII.
Okay.
Maybe when I first read Cobbett, I was sort of shocked by the powerful language he gives, and just reminding myself continually, like, this guy is not some Catholic who just wants to attack the Reformation. Right. He is himself a Protestant.
And I think that's good for our viewers and a lot of my friends.
Yes.
You know, and that literally they're good people. When I think of Protestants, I think a lot of them really have a relationship with Jesus Christ. They really follow him. They listen to him. They want to live a moral life.
Yeah.
But this will be shocking to them because, again, what we grew up with and what I started teaching with in almost all the history books, he's positive. It's positive.
Yes.
It's certainly not as negative as I've heard this before. I want you to go for it.
So this is what Cobbett says. He says, thus expired in the year 1547, King Henry VIII's death, in the 56th year of his age and in the 38th of his reign, the most unjust, hard-hearted, meanest, and most sanguinary, bloodletting tyrant that the world has ever beheld, whether heathen or Christian. That England, which he found in peace, unity, plenty, and happiness, he left torn by factions and schisms, her people wandering about in beggary and misery. He laid the foundations of immorality, dishonesty, and pauperism. Think of like the welfare state and underclass. All which produced an abundant harvest in the reigns of his unhappy, barren, mischievous, and miserable children, with whom by the end of a few years his house and his name were extinguished forever. How he disposed of the plunder of the church and the poor, how his successors completed that work of confiscation which he had carried on so long, how the nation sunk in point of character and of wealth, how pauperism first arose in England, how were sown the seeds of that system of which we now behold the effects in the impoverishment and degradation of the main body of the people of England and Ireland.
Wow.
He will show in the next several letters, he says.
Yeah, that was long, but it was really good. But it was shocking.
Yeah.
Definitely.
The greatest tyrant the world's ever seen, heathen or Christian.
You need to prove it to me and to our viewers. Yeah. The worst tyrant, I can think of some pretty bad tyrants. All right. So do you want to say he's the worst? Then prove that.
Yeah. So
I'll be a devil's advocate.
I think the proof would be to read all of what Cobbett says about it, all the intrigues, all the things happening. I can't go into those details, but here's a couple things. Right. Henry VIII, when he rejected the papal supremacy, he confiscated all of the church property, which some people estimated to be roughly the value of a fifth of the GDP of the country at that time. He basically stole it. Theft, that's a crime, right? He stole it, he plundered all those properties, all the churches, and gave them out to a bunch of his cronies, right? That is criminal activity. That is the activity of a tyrant.
Yeah. So you mentioned that 20% of the GDP was taken confiscated,
Plundered,
by Henry VIII. I've heard that it's up to 1/3 of the land as well. So that's a huge amount of land and wealth. And it wasn't, it wasn't really taken from like some big rich cardinal.
Right.
It was actually the people, because the rule
Right.
at the time.
The structure of their society then.
Yeah. Talk about the structure, what it was, and kind of what that did to the structure, right? Does that make sense?
You mean how he confiscated all the money and gave it to a few people?
The structure
right?
of the economy and society
Yes.
before the plundering and after.
Yes.
How did that
So
alter
everything
it
was
and
divided up into parishes, right? And a person's estate would be a common place, right? Where the people would be on that land doing things, right? And it would be organized that way.
Yeah, a regular
what you
person. Yeah, a regular person
Yes.
would have a piece of land.
Yes.
Right, and he would be farming
To use it, yes.
Yeah, the yeomanry.
Yes.
Right, and that land at that time, there's a lot of common land.
Right.
Right. So when he took all of that from the church,
He took it from those other people.
he took it not from a wealthy person, from the regular person. The regular person is now left without productive property.
without assets, right? Yeah.
So that's like capitalism.
Yes. That destroyed what I said before is the state of proprietorship. That's the word he used. The ownership society.
Yeah.
Right. They had a kind of ownership in
Yeah.
that common, and it was destroyed. It was
And it
taken
kind of-
suddenly.
Exactly. And the concentration immediately went
All that wealth,
into
all
the
that
hands of
value
a
went
few
into the hands of
people.
a few people. His
Henry
cronies.
and his cronies.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess that was like the birth of crony capitalism.
Absolutely.
speak. Yeah.
So obviously, what Belloc calls later the Reformation millionaires.
Okay.
So that's one thing.
So he stole stuff. Okay.
Yes.
A lot of stuff
Yep.
from the people.
Yeah.
From the church.
Yes.
He liquidated the monasteries.
Yes.
Those beautiful.
He
things
destroyed
they made.
He destroyed many of the properties. He had his cronies go into the actual churches and steal, right, the monstrances, right, the various vestments, things that were very valuable. He just literally stole them and they liquidated those. And you created, at that moment, literally cronies that are now capitalists.